Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and welcome once again to our Shabbat Shira on this special Shabbat when we read about the exodus of the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, from Egypt, who then headed out and crossed the Red Sea to true liberation from the Egyptian tyranny that they had undergone for over 200 years. The sermon which I'm about to deliver is considered by some to be a controversial subject, and thus it's one that can only be delivered by a rabbi or somebody who has seniority. Thus, if I'm fired for delivering it, at least I'll go out with a bang. Anyhow, I hope you will understand the comments and the points that I'm trying to make today on this very touchy subject. And that is really whether or not the Exodus is fact or fiction. Now, the Passover story, the story we're in the middle of reading in our weekly Torah readings, is at the heart of the most central, vital, important stories in the Jewish tradition. We were slaves in Egypt, and God heard our cries and He rescued us. Yeah, it took Him time, it took Him over 200 years, but nonetheless, He rescued us. And we learned so many different lessons from the Passover story, lessons about what it means to be Jewish. Lessons about how we are supposed to treat each other. But as I said at the opening, is it real? It can be hard for the modern individual to accept the Passover tale as something historical. There are so many problems to deal with. First of all, the sheer numbers of people who supposedly left Egypt. Over 600,000 men. And if you sort of extrapolate all that and add it all up, that would mean probably over 2 million people, including women and children. How would such a large number of people have survived in the desert? And if you put it into the context of the world populations at that time, if 2 million people left Egypt in those days, it wouldn't have been the Jews who left, it would have been the Egyptians. Not to mention, there's no archaeological evidence whatsoever that there was such a large group of people living in Egypt at that time. And then, of course, there are the plagues. The last 2 weeks of the Torah readings are like a supernatural thriller which we read with bated breath. If God did all these supernatural things back then why didn't God step in with some form of magic during the Shaare? Which brings us to this week's Torah reading with yet another miraculous, hard-to-believe story. The parting, of course, of the Red Sea and the drowning of Pharaoh's army while the Jews marched across on safe land. Do we have to believe all these stories are as is? Are you a bad Jew if you have a skeptical view about the historicity of the Exodus? Some of you might remember that approximately 15 years ago, as part of our educational program here at Shaare Zedek, we actually brought in a rabbi from Los Angeles, Rabbi David Wolpe, who is the senior rabbi at Sinai Temple in Los Angeles, the flagship conservative synagogue on the west coast of the United States. Well, he, 20 years ago, caused an absolute uproar in the Jewish community when he gave a sermon wherein he said, the truth is that every modern archaeologist who has investigated the story of the Exodus, with very few exceptions, agrees that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all. Now, all Rabbi Wolpe actually did was express what conservative rabbis learn in seminary, and what pretty much every conservative rabbi, certainly that I've spoke to, believes. Yet his remarks created what the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles called an absolute hurricane. The LA Times ran a front page article on biblical archaeology headlined, "Doubting the Story of the Exodus," prominently featuring Rabbi Wolpe's sermon. An Orthodox rabbi in LA had absolute apoplexy, and he said, "Everybody is in shock. Even some liberal Jews are in shock." Did he have to say what he said just before Passover? Some congregants had absolute conniptions. They were upset. They weren't going to have anything of it. And one of his congregants said, "Science can always be proven wrong." Another said, "For sure it was true. 100% it happened. If it were not true, how come we follow it for 3,300 years since?" Talk show host Dennis Prager also had to weigh in. And he said, if the Exodus didn't occur, there is no Judaism. Because Judaism stands on two pillars: the creation story and the Exodus story. Judaism no more survives the denial of the Exodus than it does the denial of the Creator. So what do we do? What do we do with the story of the Exodus? Did it happen? Does it matter if it didn't happen? Well, there have been many different attempts to reconcile the story of the Exodus with what we know scientifically. One approach is found in a story told about the Baal Shem Tov, more lovingly known as the Vesht, who is credited with being the founder of Hasidism. He said, a scientist was explaining to him that all of these so-called miracles in the Torah could be explained scientifically. For example, the water turning to blood was a red tide of algae. Cattle disease was anthrax. Darkness was an eclipse, etc., etc. And the Besht's response was, and isn't it miraculous that God created the world in such a way that those things just happened to occur when we needed them to? Now, another approach is one used by Richard Friedman in his book, The Exodus. If you haven't read it, you really should. It's worth it. Friedman claims that the Exodus was an actual historical event, but it was just the Levites, the Leviim, not the entirety of the Jewish nation that made the journey. He bases this on a lot of very interesting observations, including the fact that in all the genealogies in the Torah, only 8 Israelites have Egyptian names. And all 8, including Moses, are Levites. Now, one of the problems we have when we try and understand biblical tales such as the Exodus is that we read them the way modernity, the way modern people are used to reading, which is wrong. It is the wrong context. And in his book, Ani Ma'amin, which is biblical criticism, historical truth, and the 13 principles of faith. The author, Joshua Berman, who is both an Orthodox rabbi and a professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, says that we modern people read the Torah as if it were a history book. But in the ancient world, there was no such thing as history. We read history to find out the facts of what happened. And then we can form our own opinions about that history. But that's not how it worked in pre-modern times. Rabbi Berman goes on to say that in the ancient world, the texts that we see as history were actually exhortations. And the only reason to share historical references in the mindset then was to encourage people to believe or behave in a certain way. And that was the goal. Examples from the past were brought in to make a point. And it was very, very common to embellish the details that went into the examples, to put the words that the author wants to speak, to say in their mouth, and so on. Now, another way to look at this is, instead of trying to read the Torah as if it were some sort of history textbook, read it as if it was nothing more than a collection of poetry. There can be truths, deep truths in poetry, even perhaps especially when it describes the world not as it is in scientific terms, but as it is in the eyes of the poet who is sharing their vision. Did the Exodus happen? My own view is that something did happen, but what happened was substantially different than the way the story is told in the Torah, and certainly at our Passover tables. And that's okay, because as Rabbi Wolpe said in an interview, I think faith ought not to rest on splitting seas. For a Jew, it should rest on the wonders of God's world, the marvel of the human soul, the miracle of this small people's survival through the millennia. People such as Dennis Prager, who are highly respected in their own right, but who claim that if the Exodus didn't happen, there is no Jewish people, are actually, in my opinion, lacking in faith. Why? Because their faith is dependent on clinging to preconceived ideas, even in the face of overwhelming science evidence to the contrary. A true faith, a deep faith, doesn't depend on miraculous stories being literally true. It depends on being able to find the capital T, truth, the eternal, enduring truth that we can learn from these stories that we tell and that we want to believe in. Stories that have sustained our people through their darkest hours and encouraged them to look forward to better times. Stories that contain the ethical core of our religion. We are but 8 weeks away from Passover, when we will sit at our tables, perhaps with family, perhaps without family because of COVID. But either way, we will recite the stories that I've referred to today. When you do so, take a moment to reflect rather than just reading it by rote. Reflect what it is you truly believe and what it is that makes Passover so unique as it has done for over 3,300 years. Shabbat Shalom.